Hey everyone, Matt here, and today we're talking about getting strong the easy way, taking the easy way out with your training. So, a little bit tongue-in-cheek with the title here. In all seriousness, we're talking about auto-regulation versus percentage-based training. And I say that title kind of initially, because a lot of the proponents that I've talked with who are big proponents of the idea of percentage-based training, just doing what's on the program and not going based on how you feel, tend to feel quite strongly about autoregulation that it's really just for people who are too soft and they're taking the easy way out and they just need to shut up and train if they want to get stronger. And to be honest with you, I don't really agree with that at all. I think that, like with everything else with powerlifting, autoregulation is a tool in the toolbox. It's not the way you're going to train everybody, and it's not the way that you're going to train nobody either, right? It's going to be some people will be a good fit for it. So a couple gripes right off the bat with this. So first of all is that autoregulation isn't easy, right? It just simply allows you to take into account your fatigue levels for the day and account for that in your training, right? So if you're feeling a little bit more recovered than you'd expect, you're going to probably have some higher weights than you would normally expect to hit for whatever reps and RPE or RIR that you're going to use for your training, right? It doesn't mean that auto-regulation is going to be, only at 8, 2 in the tank or only 1 in the tank. You can definitely under-program with percentages too. So all the same problems that can happen with auto-regulation when it's used properly can happen with percentage-based training too. And you can write a block that's just a waste of time. The catch that I find with purely percentage-based programming is you start getting, especially with lifters who have varying levels of stress. And I'm not talking about every Friday they're tired from work. I'm talking about they have other factors, other stresses in their life that are maybe a little bit less predictable or cyclical, right? So maybe they're working 2 jobs, for example, and one job is very stressful sometimes, and then other times they don't have a lot of projects on the go, and they have a little bit more recovery resources available to them, but it's not always predictable where, every March, for example, they have a lot of projects, and then every April things ease up, right? It's very kind of as you go with it. So that's one of the scenarios where I found it works really well, is being able to account for those times when they're a little bit more beat up and just showing up and getting some work in and not having them, eat dirt, basically. You can pretty easily bury someone if you write a percentage-based program and say, just do what's on the sheet. You can pretty easily bury someone and just have them feel like shit about their training. You can have them miss a whole bunch of weights and kill their confidence with the lifts and really mess with their head, on top of generating a ton of fatigue from just missing lifts if they're not in a state where they're ready to lift those weights, whether that be, all-time PRs or whether that be weights they've hit already, but they're just carrying a lot more fatigue because fatigue masks performance. Yes, you can make adjustments week to week, but then you're starting to become reactive rather than proactive with your program, right? So auto-regulation, I think one of the big benefits is it allows you to be proactive and say, hey, if things are feeling good, go up, use more weight, challenge yourself a little bit more. And if things feel like crap and you're beat up and maybe that sleep you had last night, even though it was great, you're just walking in the gym and not feeling fantastic as you get under the bar, pull back. So that's kind of my main issue that I have with the auto-regulation. The other is how we use it, right? So like I mentioned earlier, we don't use auto-regulation with everybody, and we don't use percentage-based training with everybody either, right? We want to select the style of periodization we use or style of programming that we use for the athlete. So I think that the best fit for an auto-regulation based training approach, whether this be one lift on one day or the majority of the training approach that we take, is an athlete who's what I call controlled aggressive, and they're at least at an intermediate level where they have a fundamental understanding of technique, their lifts are fairly consistent, and they understand fatigue and proximity to failure, and they've experienced true failure on their lifts as well. Until you've actually felt what a max is, you're never going to be able to work your way backwards on an RPE or RIR chart until you know where the limit is. So with that athlete in mind, this is somebody who wants to see progression still, but they're not just going to let their ego take over and say, well, I'm just going to go up anyways and see how it feels, right? This is somebody who's going to say, hey, you know, normally 350 feels like this on most days, and if my top set's at 380, well, okay, cool, I can kind of make a call based on that. And it's not 100% accurate, but having that benchmark set is a really useful tool. So there's somebody who's a little bit more analytic with their lifting. Somebody who I think is actually a terrible fit for auto-regulation is, first of all, like I mentioned earlier, beginners. Crap, no good, because they don't know where that limit is they're going to progress, and really just sticking with a fixed rate of progression for the most part is going to be your best bet to progress the fastest and avoid the most screwing around. The other people I find aren't a good fit are lifters who are generally a little bit more on that technician side of things, where they tend to really get shaken up about technique breaking down a little bit. And frankly, with those maximal loads, you're going to see some change in technique, right? You're not going to lift 100% the same way you lift 50. So sometimes with those lifters, I find going with a more percentage-based approach is actually really valuable, because it tells them, I know that you have a really good attention to detail with the lifts and the technique, but I need you to put your head down and get this done. Where it can be just a little bit of that nudge to where instead of stopping at 3, they might go for that 4th or 5th rep because you said do 5, right? As opposed to if you put that down as an AMRAP, for example, on your top sets, well, they might pull back because they get a little shaken up by a technique getting a little strange on set 4 and 5. One last thing I'll mention with this before we wrap it up is the idea that as much as we'd love it all to be this way, most of us aren't elite level athletes. And so what might work for the world's best and trying to be the best in the world, where they have the luxury of increased recovery times or recovery capability, or maybe their life is a little more centered around powerlifting than yours might be, or even just genetics. As much as I hate to say it, it is a factor. It might not be a good fit for you, right? One way or another with auto-regulation or percentage-based training. And so I'd love to say I train nothing but world level powerlifters, but that's not the case. I train a lot of normal people too, who are interested in powerlifting for the idea of getting stronger and showing themselves what they can do and kind of constantly seeing improvement in themselves. And for those people, telling them to shut up and go lift weights is not always the most valuable way to train. There's some people that do really well with that, even though they're not world level. And there's some people who don't, right? So long story short here, the easiest way to progress with your training is to have a periodization style that suits your progression level and personality type the best. And then accounting for that as you build out a program. It's again one of those shitty it depends strength coach answers, but it's one that I think is worth explaining, because it's easy to get dogmatic and say, well, I use percentage based only, or I use auto-regulated only. The answer's in the middle, and it depends. Last thing I'll add is I'm doing a free training on avoiding preventable back injuries in powerlifting to get a longer powerlifting career. If you're interested in it, comment BACK, BACK, below, and I'll get an invite sent your way. Thanks, and we'll talk soon.